Lady Elenda Baratheon, the widow of Storm's End, also took a new husband that year. With Lord Boros dead and Olyvar an infant, Dornish incursions into the Stormlands had grown more numerous, and the outlaws of the Kingswood were proving troublesome. The widow felt the need of a man's strong hand to keep the peace. She chose Sir Stephen Connington, second son of the Lord of Griffin's Roost. Though 20 years younger than Lady Elenda, Connington had proved his valor during Lord Boros's campaign against the Vulture King, and was said to be as fierce as he was handsome. Elsewhere, men were more concerned with war than weddings. All along the Sunset Sea, the Red Kraken and his Ironmen continued to raid and reeve. Tirosh, Myr, Lee, and the three-headed alliance of Bravos, Pentos, and Lorith battled one another across the Stepstones and the disputed lands, whilst the rogue kingdom of Raclio Rindun pinched shut the bottom of the narrow sea. In King's Landing, Duskendale, Maidenpool, and Gulltown, trade withered. Merchants and traders came howling to the king, who either refused to see them, or was not allowed to, depending on whose chronicle we trust. The specter of famine loomed in the north, as Cregan Stark and his lord's bannermen watched their food stores dwindle, whilst the Night's Watch turned back an ever-increasing number of wildling incursions from beyond the wall. Late that year, a dreadful contagion swept across the Three Sisters. The Winter Fever, as it was called, killed half the population of Sisterton. The surviving half, believing that the disease had come to their shores on a whaler from the port of Ibn, rose up and butchered every Ibonese sailor they could lay hands on, setting fire to their ships. It made no matter. When the disease crossed the Bight to White Harbor, the prayers of the Septons and the potions of the maesters proved equally powerless against it. Thousands died, amongst them Lord Desmond Manderley. His splendid son Sir Medric, the finest knight in the north, survived him by only 4 days before succumbing to the same affliction. As Sir Medric had been childless, this had a further calamitous consequence, in that the lordship devolved upon his brother Sir Torrin, who was thence forced to give up his place on the Council of Regents to take up the rule of White Harbor. That left 4 regents, where once there had been 7. So many lords, both great and small, had perished during the Dance of the Dragons that the Citadel rightly names this time the Winter of the Widows. Never before or since in the history of the 7 kingdoms have so many women wielded so much power, ruling in the place of their slain husbands, brothers, and fathers, for sons in swaddling clothes are still on the teat. Many of their stories have been collected in Archmaester Abellin's Mammoth When Women Ruled, Ladies of the Aftermath. Though Abelin treats hundreds of widows, we must needs confine ourselves to fewer. 4 such women played crucial parts in the history of the realm in late 132 and early 133 AC, whether for good or ill. Foremost of these was Lady Johanna, the widow of Castle Rock, who ruled the domains of House Lannister for her young son, Lord Loren. She had appealed time and time again to Aegon the Three-Ard's Hand, her late lord husband's twin, for aid against the Reavers, but none had been forthcoming. Desperate to protect her people, Lady Johanna at last donned a man's mail to lead the men of Lannisport and Castle Rock against the foe. The songs tell of how she slew a dozen ironmen beneath the walls of Case, but those may be safely put aside as the work of drunken singers. Johanna carried a banner into battle, not a sword. Her courage did help inspire her Westermen, however, for the raiders were soon routed and Case was saved. Amongst the dead was the Red Kraken's favorite uncle. Lady Shari's Footley, the widow of Tumbleton, achieved a different sort of fame by her efforts to restore that shattered town. Ruling in the name of her infant son, half a year after Second Tumbleton, she had given birth to a lusty dark-haired boy whom she proclaimed her late lord husband's trueborn heir, though it was far more likely that the boy had been sired by bold John Roxton. Lady Shari's pulled down the burned shells of shops and houses, rebuilt the town walls, buried the dead, planted wheat and barley and turnips in the fields where the camps had been, and even had the heads of the dragons Seasmoke and Vermithor cleaned and mounted and displayed in the town square, where travelers paid good coin to view them, a penny for a look, a star to touch them. In Aldtown, relations between the High Septon and Lord Ormond's widow, the Lady Sam, continued to worsen when she ignored His High Holiness's command to remove herself from her stepson's bed and take vows as a silent sister as penance for her sins. Righteous in his wrath, the High Septon condemned the Dowager Lady of Aldtown as a shameless fornicator and forbade her to set foot in the Starry Sept until she had repented and sought forgiveness. Instead, Lady Samantha mounted a warhorse and burst into the Sept as His High Holiness was leading a prayer. When he demanded to know her purpose, Lady Sam replied that whilst he had forbidden her to set foot in the Sept, he had said naught about her horse's hooves. Then she commanded her knights to bar the doors. If the Sept was closed to her, it would be closed to all. Though he quaked and thundered and called down maledictions upon this harlot on a horse, in the end the High Septon had no choice but to relent. The fourth, and last, for our purposes, of these remarkable women emerged from the twisted towers and blasted keeps of Harrenhal, that vast ruin beside the water of the God's Eye. Shunned and forgotten since Daemon Targaryen and his nephew Aemond had met there for their final flight, Black Heron's accursed seat had become a haunt of outlaws, robber knights, and broken men, who sallied forth from behind its walls to prey upon travelers, fisherfolk, and farmers. A year ago, they had been few, but of late their numbers had grown, and it was being said that a sorceress ruled over them, a witch queen of fearsome power. When these tales reached King's Landing, Sir Tyland decided it was time to reclaim the castle. This task he entrusted to a knight of the Kingsguard, Sir Regis Groves, who set out from the city with 100 seasoned men. At Castle Derry, he was joined by Sir Daemon Derry with a like number. Rashly, Sir Regis assumed this would be more than sufficient to deal with a few squatters. Arriving before the walls of Harrenhal, however, he found the gates closed and hundreds of armed men on the battlements. There were at least 600 souls within the castle, a third of them men of fighting age. When Sir Regis demanded to speak to their lord, a woman emerged to treat with him, with a child beside her. The Witch Queen of Harrenhal proved to be none other than Alice Rivers, the baseborn wet nurse who had been the prisoner and then the paramour of Prince Aemon Targaryen, and now claimed to be his widow. The boy was Aemon's, she told the knight. His bastard, said Sir Regis. His trueborn son and heir, Alice Rivers spat back, and the rightful king of Westeros. She commanded the knight to kneel before your king, and swear him his sword. Sir Regis laughed at this, saying, I do not kneel to bastards, much less the baseborn whelp of a kinslayer and a milk cow. What happened next remains a matter of some dispute. Some say that Alice Rivers merely raised a hand, and Sir Regis began to scream and clutch his head, until his skull burst apart, spraying blood and brains. Others insist the widow's gesture was a signal, at which a crossbowman on the battlements let fly a bolt that took Sir Regis through an eye. Mushroom, who was hundreds of leagues away, has suggested that perhaps one of the men on the walls was skilled in the use of a sling. Soft lead balls, when slung with sufficient force, have been known to cause the sort of explosive effect that Groves's men saw and attributed to sorcery. Whatever the case, Sir Regis Groves was dead in an instant. Half a heartbeat later, the gates of Harrenhal burst open, and a swarm of howling riders charged forth. A bloody fight ensued. The king's men were put to rout. Sir Daemon Derry, being well horsed, well armored, and well trained, was one of the few to escape. The Witch Queen's minions hunted him all through the night before abandoning the chase. Some 32 men lived to return to Castle Derry, of the 100 that had set out. The next day, a 33rd made his appearance. Having been captured with a dozen others, he had been forced to watch them die by torture one by one before being turned loose to deliver a warning. I'm to tell you what she said, he gasped, but you can't laugh. The widow put a curse on me. Any man o' you laughs, I die. When Sir Daemon assured him that no one was going to laugh at him, the messenger said, Don't come again unless you mean to bend your knees, she says. Any man who comes near her walls will die. There's power in them stones, and the widow's woken it. 7 save us all, she has a dragon. I seen it. The name of the messenger is lost to us, along with the name of the man who laughed. But someone did, one of Lord Derry's men. The messenger looked at him, stricken, then clutched at his throat and began to wheeze. Unable to draw breath, he was dead in moments. Supposedly the imprints of a woman's fingers could be seen upon his skin, as if she had been in the room, choking him. The death of a Kingsguard knight was greatly troubling to Sir Tyland, though Onwin Peake discounted Sir Daemon Derry's talk of sorcery and dragons and put down the death of Regis Groves and his men to outlaws. The other regents concurred. A stronger force would be required to root them out of Harrenhal. They concluded as that peaceful year of 132 AC came to its end. But before Sir Tyland could organize such an assault, or even consider who might take Sir Regis's place in Aegon VII, a threat far worse than any Witch Queen descended on the city. For on the third day of 133 AC, winter fever arrived in King's Landing. Whether or not the fever had been born in the dark forests of IB and brought to Westeros by a whaler, as the sistermen believed, it was assuredly moving from port to port. White Harbor, Ghoultown, Maidenpool, and Duskendale had been afflicted, each in turn. There were reports that Braavos was being ravaged as well. The first sign of the disease was a red flush of the face, easily mistaken for the bright red cheeks that many men exhibit after exposure to the frosty air of a cold winter's day. But fever followed, slight at first, but rising, ever rising. Bleeding did not help, nor garlic, nor any of the various potions, poultices, and tinctures that were tried. Packing the afflicted in tubs of snow and icy water seemed to slow the course of the fever, but did not halt it, those maesters who grappled with the disease soon found. By the second day the victim would begin to shiver violently and complain of being cold, though he might feel burning hot to the touch. On the third day came delirium and bloody sweats. By the fourth day the man was dead, or on the path to recovery, should the fever break. Only 1 man in 4 survived the winter fever. Not since the shivers ravaged Westeros during the reign of Jaehaerys had such a terrible pestilence been seen in the 7 kingdoms. In King's Landing, the first signs of the fatal flush were seen along the riverside amongst the sailors, ferrymen, fishermongers, dockers, stevedores, and wharfside whores who plied their trades beside the Blackwater rush. Before most had even realized they were ill, they had spread the contagion throughout every part of the city, to rich and poor alike. When word reached court, Grand Maester Munkin went himself to examine some of those afflicted, to ascertain whether this was indeed the winter fever and not some lesser illness. Alarmed by what he saw, Munkin did not return to the castle, for fear that he himself might have been afflicted by his close contact with 20 feverish whores and dockers. Instead he sent his acolyte with an urgent letter to the king's hand. Sir Tyland acted immediately, commanding the gold cloaks to close the city and see that no one entered or left until the fever had run its course. He ordered the great gates of the Red Keep barred as well, to keep the disease from king and court. The winter fever had no respect for gates or guards or castle walls, alas. Though the fever seemed to have grown somewhat less potent as it moved south, tens of thousands turned feverish in the days that followed. 3/4 of those died. Grand Maester Munkin proved to be one of the fortunate 4th and recovered. But Sir Willis Fell, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was struck down together with 2 of his sworn brothers. The Lord Protector, Leo and Corbray, retired to his chambers when stricken and tried to cure himself with hot mulled wine. He died, along with his mistress and several of his servants. 2 of Queen Jaehaerys' maids grew feverish and succumbed, though the little queen herself remained hale and healthy. The commander of the city watch died. 9 days later, his successor followed him into the grave. Nor were the regents spared. Lord Westerling and Lord Moudon both grew ill. Lord Moudon's fever broke and he survived, though much weakened. Roland Westerling, an older man, perished. One death may have been a mercy. The Dowager Queen Alicent of House Hightower, second wife of King Viserys I and mother to his sons, Aegon, Aemond, and Daeron, and his daughter Helaena, died on the same night as Lord Westerling, after confessing her sins to her septa. She had outlived all of her children and spent the last year of her life confined to her apartments, with no company but her septa, the serving girls who brought her food, and the guards outside her door. Books were given her, and needles and thread, but her guards said Alicent spent more time weeping than reading or sewing. One day she ripped all her clothing into pieces. By the end of the year she had taken to talking to herself, and had come to have a deep aversion to the color green. In her last days the Queen Dowager seemed to become more lucid. "I want to see my sons again," she told her septa, and Helaena, "my sweet girl, oh, and King Jaehaerys. I will read to him, as I did when I was little. He used to say I had a lovely voice." Strangely, in her final hours Queen Alicent spoke often of the old king, but never of her husband, King Viserys. The stranger came for her on a rainy night, at the hour of the wolf. All these deaths were recorded faithfully by Septon Eustace, who takes care to give us the inspiring last words of every great lord and noble lady. Mushroom names the dead as well, but spends more time on the follies of the living, such as the homely squire who convinced a pretty bedmaid to yield her virtue to him by telling her he had the flush and, "In 4 days I will be dead, and I would not die without ever knowing love." The ploy proved so successful that he returned to it with 6 other girls. But when he failed to die, they began to talk, and his scheme unraveled. Mushroom attributes his own survival to drink. "If I drank sufficient wine, I reasoned I might never know I was sick, and every fool knows that the things you do not know will never hurt you." During those dark days, 2 unlikely heroes came briefly to the fore. One was Orwyle, whose jailers freed him from his cell after many other maesters had been laid low by the fever. Old age, fear, and long confinement had left him a shell of the man that he had been, and his cures and potions proved no more efficacious than those of other maesters, yet Orwyle worked tirelessly to save those he could and ease the passing of those he could not. The other hero, to the astonishment of all, was the young king. To the horror of his Kingsguard, Aegon spent his days visiting the sick, and often sat with them for hours, sometimes holding their hands in his own, or soothing their fevered brows with cool, damp cloths. Though his grace seldom spoke, he shared his silences with them, and listened as they told him stories of their lives, begged him for forgiveness, or boasted of conquests, kindnesses, and children. Most of those he visited died, but those who lived would afterward attribute their survival to the touch of the king's healing hands. Yet if indeed there is some magic in a king's touch, as many smallfolk believe, it failed when it was needed most. The last bedside visited by Aegon III was that of Sir Tyland Lannister. Through the city's darkest days, Sir Tyland had remained in the Tower of the Hand, striving day and night against the stranger. Though blind and maimed, he suffered no more than exhaustion almost to the last. But as cruel fate would have it, when the worst was past and new cases of the winter fever had dropped away to almost nothing, a morning came when Sir Tyland commanded his serving man to close a window. "It is very cold in here," he said, though the fire in the hearth was blazing, and the window was already closed. The hand declined quickly after that. The fever took his life in 2 days instead of the usual 4. Septon Eustace was with him when he died, as was the boy king that he had served. Aegon took his hand as he breathed his last. Sir Tyland Lannister had never been beloved. After the death of Queen Rhaenyra, he had urged Aegon II to put her son Aegon to death as well, and certain blacks hated him for that. Yet after the death of Aegon II, he had remained to serve Aegon III, and certain Greens hated him for that. Coming second from his mother's womb, a few heartbeats after his twin brother, Jason, had denied him the glory of lordship and the gold of Castle Rock, leaving him to make his own place in the world. Sir Tyland never married nor fathered children, so there were few to mourn him when he was carried off. The veil he wore to conceal his disfigured face gave rise to the tale that the visage underneath was monstrous and evil. Some called him craven for keeping Westeros out of the Daughters' War and doing so little to curb the Greyjoys in the west. By moving 3/4 of the crown's gold from King's Landing whilst Aegon II's master of coin, Tyland Lannister had sown the seeds of Queen Rhaenyra's downfall, a stroke of cunning that would in the end cost him his eyes, ears, and health, and cost the queen her throne and her very life. Yet it must be said that he served Rhaenyra's son well and faithfully as hand.